Hello, and welcome to edition 2 of That's All, the podcast where it's two friends chatting about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. No, just kidding. It's us just talking shit about whatever is on our minds at the moment. And today, we're going to be talking about the value of creatives, especially during this time of coronavirus, where everyone's turning to entertainment in various forms to survive the mental instability of lockdown. We're going to kick off by talking about our new in section, the Loewe AW2020 show, and then we're just going to talk about creativity and its value and what the importance of it is.
Okay, so for those of you that listened to our first edition, our backstory edition, you'll know that we have a little segment in this podcast called our new in section, and today we're actually starting with that. This show obviously took place a little while ago now, but we kind of just wanted to go back and kind of talk about this show because there's kind of some interesting aspects of it that, like most fashion shows, are more than meet the eye. So I'll start off maybe just by giving some background. If people want to follow along, I recommend going onto Vogue Catwalk and typing in Loewe AW2020 so that you can take a look at all of these wonderful pieces of clothing that we're talking about. So the thing about Loewe is that they organize every year the Loewe Craft Prize, which isn't actually so much to do with fashion, but to do with highlighting, as the name would suggest, craftsmanship. So things like ceramics, for example. And this is actually one of the first shows where the sort of craft prize Loewe met runway Loewe. And once you kind of know that, you can really start to see it in these looks. And that actually happened because this show is actually in collaboration with, I'm going to butcher the name, I very much apologize, Takuro Kawata, who was actually awarded a special mention in the 2018 Craft Prize. And so this collaboration also inspired the use of quite a few Japanese fabrics throughout it. But you can see his work physically through a lot of breastplates on dresses. I don't remember what the look numbers were off the top of my head. Do you remember the look numbers, Kelly?
20 and 33.
Yeah, so if you're looking on Vogue, on the Vogue catwalk, then look 20 and 33 show these kind of breastplates that aren't actually designed to really be reproduced beyond this runway show, because it really wouldn't be cost efficient and make any sense, but they were kind of created in collaboration, and that's what kind of brought that to life. So it's really interesting once you kind of know that there's this background to it that is to do with highlighting craftsmanship and some Japanese fabrics. You start to really understand what these sort of subjectively weird shapes are about. Maybe, Kelly, you can talk to us a bit more about some of these weird looks that came out from Loewe this year.
Yeah, so I think kind of the overall aesthetic of this show, I would describe it as very almost neutral in tone. To me, this palette is very much a artsy palette. There's a lot of neutrals with pops of like blue and a muted green and a muted almost corally red thrown in here and there. But it's very much about playing with the shapes of the body, which is kind of something that comes from Japanese design. It's not obvious. It's not like the Mets through the looking glass of Chinese fashion. It's not that obvious. It's not as if we're paying homage to Japanese design or Japanese fashion, but there is kind of this element of disguising the body that is very much reminiscent of when Japanese designers came to the quote-unquote Western fashion world. So artists like Rie Kawakubo or Issei Miyake or Yohji Yamamoto, when they kind of came on the scene, they revolutionized fashion design because they weren't necessarily dressing the body, they were creating the body into new shapes. They were making it something different. They weren't trying to necessarily accent the body, but to change it. And you see that a lot in this collection. There's a lot of things that we'll probably talk about later, how shoulders are played with, and almost this idea of it's not an immediately accessible fashion show. This is not ready to wear. No one really looks at most of these things and says, oh yes, I would wear that. I want that in my closet. Like, that looks great on a person. They're more fine art in a way. And I feel like that's kind of the vibe you get out of this collection.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's one of those that if you're, whoever you are, how interested in fashion you are, even just listening to this, and if you haven't seen it, it is one of those shows that arguably you do look at and kind of go, huh? And I know that for a lot of people, especially those who don't look at fashion content, they can kind of feel sometimes confused by it because there is actually a need for you to kind of put in the effort as an audience, as a reader, to kind of digest the messaging that's put these items of clothing. And I think that can sometimes be lost because obviously from a commercial perspective, clothes just have a purpose and they're not looked at in the same way art is. And so people don't expect to have to really engage their brains in the same way as they would if they maybe go to an art gallery, you know, and see like a banana on the wall. So with this show, I think it really highlights this idea that obviously fashion is, you know, a huge part of fashion is desire. And though desire and creating desire is something that's utterly timeless, and that will always be something I think that is part of the industry, the ways that we create that will shift and will change. And this is just a really intriguing way of doing it, by basically portraying fashion as art in a much more challenging way that isn't just about being aesthetically pleasing. It's about challenging people to go ahead and like it, basically.
Right, like going off of that, a lot of these looks in some ways aren't meant to be pleasing on the body. Like if you look at even just the first two looks, they're really elongating the torso in this very strange way that's almost alien or other. Like it's creating an accent in a strange place that wouldn't necessarily be flattering. Even on the models, like it was made for the size of the model. So on anyone else, it's going to look even stranger because they're not made for any other proportion. Like look 5, which has this almost weird elevated drop waist. It almost bisects the body and creates this weird division of like a person dissected and then put back together. There's a lot of play on shoulders in this collection where they're accented or dropped. You see a lot of instances where there would normally be a seam at the shoulder to accent the shoulder. It's kind of gotten rid of, so it makes the shoulders look slouchy and drooping, which highlights the neck in a strange way. And there's giant lapels that do that almost eliminate the shoulder completely. It's like you have neck and then lapel and then sleeve. They're more akin to fine art. You're not meant to understand them as an aesthetically pleasing object. It's driving you to question what is aesthetically pleasing and why. And that's kind of what makes it fine art. More specifically, contemporary art or modern art is a very controversial topic because you can't just go into a gallery and just look at it and like it necessarily. You can with some things, but usually there's always a context. And if you don't know the context, it's difficult to understand it. And while that used to be in things like fine art paintings, during certain periods, they would make the hands almost creepily long because it was supposed to be considered attractive at the time or elegant at the time. And now you're just like, wow, they drew hands really weird. But for some reason, we still appreciate it because it's fine art, but we don't give contemporary art necessarily the same leeway. So it's obvious that this collection is really trying to get you to question that.
The show is punctuated kind of with these moments of more recognizable things. Look 40, for example, is arguably an LBD, kind of a long black dress, even, you could say. And there are some looks in there that kind of give you that moment to sort of take a breath back out of the slightly more weird and abstract and kind of keep you connected and keep you interested. I think look 32, for example, is a really interesting kind of monochromatic. It doesn't challenge you in the same way. It's still very different to something we've seen before, but it's a little bit more familiar. And I think that's because, kind of in the same way of contemporary art, there's an obvious audience that is the enthusiasts of modern art and things like that, and the people who are, you know, hardcore Loewe fans, for example, and they come with the anticipation and the hope to actually be challenged in this way. That's what they come here for. And then these kind of moments of things we recognize, like I just mentioned, are for the people who maybe come in and weren't ready to be challenged. And what I think this does is, like I said, in terms of creating desire, you manage to create desire by forcing someone to give themselves a deeper knowledge in order to understand it. And it feels like once you've gone through that sort of mental process of understanding where the designer is coming from, there's a desire for ownership, because owning it also is owning the knowledge of what this piece means. And that's the case with modern art in the same way as it would be with these modern designers, where owning this piece that other people don't understand gives you essentially kind of almost cultural capital, if we're going to go into like that area of things, if we're going to rope Bourdieu into this. But it does give you that sort of knowledge that you can kind of show just through owning something that isn't necessarily mainstream even. And I think that kind of weirdness is a great great thing to kind of challenge people into what they want to own and represent and even dress themselves as.
Right, like you mentioned the word challenged. Like, that is the point of these fashion shows sometimes. I feel like a lot of people have this idea of fashion being very shallow, and there's this expectation of like, well, it's just stuff that you put on your body. It's just clothes. And it's like, on the one hand, for a lot of people, and for in a lot of instances, clothes are just clothes. Like, they are things that you have to wear to go out into society, and whether or not you put all kinds of other fanciful ideas of identity onto it, you are picking clothes just to dress yourself sometimes. But fashion is constantly changing, and I'm not just talking about runways. I'm talking about general cultural aesthetic ideals. Those things are shaped on the runway by people who are pushing the envelope. So if you never try anything new or try something when people look at it and go, oh, well, I don't like that because it doesn't appeal to my aesthetic ideas right now, you'll never be challenged and nothing new will ever happen. So while we may look at a lot of these and like, look 44, she's very jellyfish-esque, but you're not going to see any one of these looks in everyday wear, but you might see elements of these looks in everyday wear. Maybe it'll be the giant flowy track pant bottoms. Maybe we'll start seeing shoulder seams move down the arm a little bit. You don't get innovation by playing it safe and doing what everyone else is doing. And that's the point of these shows.
Yeah, no one ever innovated without offending at least a couple people, right?
When we looked at the first two, we were like, I don't like these proportions.
I think but that's what I love about it, is you end up looking at it and you kind of think, oh, I don't like it. And you're like, why don't I like it? And then you kind of sit with it and live with it and end up kind of bonding with it and end up in a weird place where you sort of think, do I suddenly want this now? And I think that just teaches people that your instinct reaction to kind of give things a chance, and that change or difference isn't always a bad thing, and that some of the best things happen outside your comfort zone, and that, as Kelly said, these things will trickle down into something that does make sense in everyday life. And whether that is slightly more drop waists, or whether our shoulder seams start moving out, or whether track pants become very voluminous and people won't know, but that will all come from these kind of designers. So
right. I do like the essence of this idea of you look at it and you go, oh, I don't like that. And then once you analyze why you don't like that, suddenly you're like, well, now I've formed a connection with it.
Yeah, exactly. Not entirely unrelated, our main topic for today's edition is the hidden talent of creatives in the age of coronavirus, which is essentially going to be Kelly and I pulling apart a thought or statement about the creative process and work of creative artists, which, just kind of got us thinking. The premise that we have is that, in a sense, the more effort you put in as a creative, the more effortless the result. So inherently, creative work, whatever that may be, whatever shape that comes in, doesn't naturally ask for the same recognition as other work does, especially if the audience doesn't have knowledge of the process. So the better a sort of painter you are, for example, the less you necessarily see the work and craft behind that painting, or potentially, let's say, a musician. It's kind of that make it look easy thing, that the better you are at it, the less you see those hours of craft, because the more you iron out the creases that would necessarily expose that. And you don't really show your work in the same way that sort of you do as a mathematician or something like that, where people just know they couldn't possibly do it. It's kind of the background work of creatives, I feel like, isn't as exposed as it is in other industries. So yeah, that's what we're kind of going for today.
Right. It's almost like this idea of when you look at a building, you don't see the blueprints of the architecture. Like, you don't see like when they had to go through and decide how everything was built, because then that building would be unsafe. You just see the finished product. And sometimes it doesn't necessarily show the years of work that went into it. And that's kind of true in a lot of professions, but I think there's a few inherent problems with creativity, and one of them is this idea of the creative process almost being nebulous. There's something about creativity that it's not a process that can necessarily be defined. On the one hand, it's different for everybody. It's not like 1 + 1 = 2. You know, there's not a defined equation to get to a creative idea. It's depending on the artist and the situation, it's different for everybody. And so that might be writing things down. It might be you just sit around and think about it. And there's an idea that almost because you can't define that process, it's not work. And then there's this other thing where if you like what you're doing, then it's not work. And on the one hand, that's true, but on the other hand, I'm still working and I should be fucking paid. Not to get aggressive about it, but I'm just saying.
I'm not bitter. It's true, though. I think there's something inherently, like, it's not, in terms of most creative work, again, we're covering, like, a lot of things, like, you know, whether it's painting or fashion or art or whatnot, that isn't quantifiable in the same way. If you're, I don't know if it's like physics or something, or even engineering, the better you get, the more complex your processes get, and the more sort of developed your results are, like the more complicated your like creations are even. So even someone who doesn't necessarily understand engineering basically just can see that it's got more complicated. There's something not as quantifiable about the creative process.
Right. Like, for instance, I was doing some research on freelance work as a creative, and specifically for web design, because that was something I was getting into at the time. I was listening to a podcast where someone was talking about why you shouldn't charge per hour, which me, coming from a commercial art background in college and then going into fashion for my master's, there's certain benefits to charging per hour. For instance, if you have a client who makes a lot of changes, if you charge them by hour, then they're charged for those changes, as opposed for if you charge by project, if they make a lot of changes, you're not getting paid for those. But for web design, for instance, this guy was talking about how he had spent so many years being a web designer that suddenly he could create an entire site that looks good and functions great in like 3 hours. So he talked about one instance where he basically did that and he charged the client per hour. He got paid like $200 for a full functioning website, which is a several $1,000 endeavor. So it's this idea of the better you get, the easier it is to do really great work quickly. And on the other hand is this idea of you don't see everything that goes into it. And I think this is highlighted for me most in my academic experience. So this isn't necessarily something you do in the workplace, but you do it when you're being graded on things, because people who are grading creatives know that a lot of your time and the creativity in your work takes place before the final product. As an illustrator, there's a lot of time spent on the idea of thumbnails, and thumbnails are like really tiny compositional sketches to kind of think about how the flow of the piece will go, but you wouldn't show them to a client. They're not like sketches where you're like, oh yes, I can see it's a person. It's like vague shapes. And so you would always be required per project to do a certain number of thumbnails. For me, a lot of my thought process goes on in my head. So I wouldn't make a lot of thumbnails. I would think about it for a long time and then make like 1 or 2 thumbnails and pick one. Eventually, I had a professor tell me, she was like, you're not getting good grades on your pre-work because you don't have any. And I was like, well, yeah, I think about it a lot. And she said, write down what you think about. And once I started doing that, I would make pages of notes of what I was thinking about, going on tangents of like what colors I would use because the colors mean certain things or link to certain things in mythology. And then I would like break open a book and read like encyclopedia entries about the symbolism of different things and how I would apply that later. But that doesn't come across in the thumbnail. You don't get my 5 hours of work about the symbolism of ravens. And that's something that carried over into our master's, where we were, and Emily, you had to make these 2 process journals. Did you only have to make 1?
Yeah, gosh.
First term?
Yeah, I know what you mean, because, so for anyone who doesn't know, I was on the journalism pathway of our master's, and Kelly was on the creative, so I did do creative things, but we didn't always have the exact same assignments, and we did have a couple process journals that kind of had to show, it's essentially showing your work. It's like that thing in high school where they say show your work, and you're like, oh, I just want to guess the answer, and it's because what they're trying to do, which is what I think should happen more with creatives, is they're trying to put value on your creative process or on the process of getting to the result, so that should the result be incorrect when it is something like maths or whatever, they can at least appreciate how close you got to getting it right and not just be in a sort of yes or no, right or wrong area.
Like you said, it is showing your work. It's showing the full problem. But I think, like we've been saying with art, you just want the final piece. Like on a book cover, you don't want all of the sketches also on the book cover. You just want the book cover. There's no place for anyone to appreciate the work that went into it. Actually, you're getting a little bit more of that on things like Instagram and social media now. I think of Instagram more as an artist's sketchbook. Like, yes, you want to see the final product, But what I'm looking for on Instagram is behind the scenes. I'm looking for their process work because I find that just as interesting as the final. I'll still want to own a print, but I want to go to Instagram to get like their sketches and their process videos and how they got there, because that's the creativity part.
I think that's so true. I didn't even think of that social media actually has had a hand in, I know it's changed definitely the field of creatives and what people are able to do, because we also have a lot of kind of like automated stuff. Like you've got a lot of things at your fingertips and tools that will generate things for you. But then in the same way, I've seen so many people who follow artists who will do like time lapses of their work, and they'll really appreciate that process behind it. And I think when you think of the hidden talent, or even when you're thinking about, your friend who was talking about pricing his website, what you're paying for isn't the work they will put in for the specific service or whatever it is they're doing for you. You're paying for the fact that they got themselves to a point to be able to offer you that service. And I always think of my sister, actually. This was when she was kind of at the peak of her dancing career, essentially. She's still dancing unofficially now, but isn't part of a company anymore. But at the time, she was in a lot of shows and she was doing really well and getting a lot of sort of big parts and big roles. And a lot of people would say to her, oh, you're so lucky you're such a good dancer. You're so lucky that you have such good dancing skills, essentially. And she would joke and say, yeah, I'm really lucky I put 10 years of work into this. It's kind of like that quote that's the harder I work, the luckier I get. People put creative work, because there is a creative flair in people. People are more naturally, have a natural rhythm or a natural flair or something that gets it going. That only gets you so far. And beyond that is kind of initiative. There's a process to kind of hone your skill in and decide where you want to use it and how you want to show it. I think people forget that this is just as much of an exercise in like creative activities like dance and things like that. And just because you enjoy it and may have some natural rhythm, there's a lot more to it. And that's what you're valuing, and that's what you're paying for when you're paying for someone to offer you their creative work.
There's this lack of appreciation for how much training goes into the arts. Like, I think people understand it on a basic level, but there's this idea that like we're wizards. It's like if you know one thing, suddenly you know everything. Because you know graphic design, someone will come to you and be like, so you can do like full-scale 3D animation, right? And you're like, no. Because of this nebulous idea of like idea creation and creativity, it's almost like people look at it and because they can't see the process, they're just like, well, that's witchcraft. Maybe, but I spent a long time practicing this witchcraft. Like, I got a degree in this witchcraft.
I got a degree in this.
I have a degree in wizardry.
But there's also the complete opposite that's true, which obviously there's this, oh, I couldn't possibly, you're so lucky that you have this magical skill, this kind of, I don't even know, like romanticization of it even or whatever. And then there's the other side of things of the, I could paint that, or I could have done that. And we've talked about this a lot. I think it's also something that we have to remind ourselves when we do it and we go like, oh, we could have done that. And you kind of have to go, okay, well, why didn't you? Are you missing skills or initiative? And that's, again, another part of the creative process that is really easy to underestimate. You see some of these really simple, beautiful illustrations that are like, just an assortment of shapes and some patterns or whatever it is. The mechanics behind it aren't overly complicated. It's a triangle and a square and like a squiggle on top or whatever. And you think, oh, I could have drawn that. And yes, if you look at that and were asked to recreate it, a lot of people could recreate it. But what you can't do or didn't do was think of that combination, consider how it would work together, design it, and also have the initiative to do it. Initiative is actually something we should value as well. It shouldn't just be what the mechanics are behind things, even though they're also valuable. I think this is what makes us say as well that if you're going to manage creatives, like if you're going to hire them, you don't need to be able to do what you're hiring them to do. You don't need to be an illustrator to manage someone who is an illustrator. You just need to appreciate what they do, because there's no point in hiring a bunch of creative people and micromanaging them, because a huge thing you're hiring them to do is their creative process and the way that they generate ideas and their initiative to push them forward. You're not just hiring them because they know how to control a paintbrush or a cursor. You're hiring them because of how their mind works. And you kind of have to just let that work in order to get the best out of it.
We talk about this idea of over-the-shoulder designing, and it's when your art director stands behind you while you're at your computer, and then you just feel like a keyboard, and they're like, move this here. Ugh. And like, sometimes that's good. Like, I've done projects where I'll sit in a room and put my screen up onto a giant monitor and have everyone in the room be like, okay, well, I think we should do this. And there are cases where you need to do that. But when someone, instead of like giving you actual art direction, decides that you're just a mouse they're going to move around, and you're sitting there going, no, I don't think we should do this. That's not why you hired me. That's not what I'm here for.
It's a waste.
It is. It's a waste, and it's also, like you said, it's this idea of everyone, I think, has that moment of, oh, well, I could have done that. It's like, yeah, but you didn't. That's kind of the thing that I think frustrates people about modern art, is that a lot of it is like, oh, I could have done that. I wouldn't hang that in my home because I could have done that, or because it's not like refined. Even I'm guilty of this. Like, there's very few contemporary modern art pieces that I would, like, if I had wealth, would pay for. Like, I always say there's a lot of them that just look like color theory studies, where it's like a circle of this color overlapping a circle of this color in the middle makes a different color. And I'm just like, yeah, we did that freshman year of college. Like, I'm not thrilled by it. The key is that they're doing something else conceptually under that, but if you just look at it from an aesthetic perspective, you're like, eh. And there's this idea that the conceptual part of it's not important, and it is.
It's kind of like what we were saying about Loewe and fashion shows. Yeah, if you just look at it face value straight off the bat, you might not get it. It might not make sense. It might not be pretty, or it might be super simple. You need to just engage that little bit more with it to understand what's below the surface. And I think that's what this whole thing of us saying that, you know, creatives can be undervalued is coming from. I didn't even know there was that term of the over shoulder thing, but as soon as you said it, I could just picture exactly what you meant. It's a shame, because that's a whole reason for hiring these people, is that they have the ability to take tasks and sort of make something creative out of them, and not just do the like sort of mechanics of it. But I wonder, do you think maybe in terms of right now, I feel like there's a lot of talk about creatives because of us all being stuck in our homes, and a lot of freelance people both struggling and also thriving, because a lot of people are consuming content, but obviously if you're freelance, it's kind of a difficult time. But do you think maybe this situation has helped with people understanding the value of kind of creative jobs and stuff?
I think that's kind of something that remains to be seen. I have heard it mentioned by quite a few people, but I think it's often mentioned by people who are at least somewhat in the creative sphere, like bloggers or like YouTubers. People are sitting around and experiencing art more than they ever have before. Like, if you think about it, all of us who are stuck at home, what are you doing to stay sane? You're reading books, you're watching movies, you're playing video games, you're playing board games. That still involves a lot of art. You're doing all of these things that involve artists. Like, everyone who's using things like Zoom or Skype or even FaceTime or being on your phone, there's a user experience or user interface designer who's making that screen look a certain way so that you can navigate it easily and that it looks nice. So I think we're in this period of we're really appreciating that without these things, we would be going insane. But I don't know if it's so obvious that after Corona is over, if anyone will appreciate that. Like, artists, as we've kind of mentioned, are like massively undervalued and underpaid. If a company is having financial trouble, the first person to go is the artist, even though usually what that artist does is exponentially valuable to the business. So will we start to realize that because we're spending all this time with art and the aesthetics of things are very important and creativity is important for everyone to experience, will that lead to us paying our artists better wages and not firing them immediately? I don't know. It's like, especially in American schools, the first thing to go is always the art department. Like, that's the first thing to get funding cut. I've had this argument with people who aren't in creative industries because you get a lot of flack when you go to an art school. And I even had a professor at my art school who taught a science class because we had like one mandatory science class. He said, you don't get enough real teaching at this school to deserve a college degree. So since we don't take a certain number of literature classes, or because we're not taking calculus or some shit, that means that we don't deserve a college degree. We don't deserve a piece of paper that recognizes our value to society for the job that we're trying to do. It's this idea that science or math is better and separate, but it's not. Like, if you have a mathematician or a scientist who thinks creatively, you have a better mathematician or scientist. You still need to innovate in those fields. And if you don't have someone who knows how to think creatively or has experience thinking creatively, you're losing something. But will that lead to us paying artists better after Corona? I don't know.
I don't know in terms of the long-term thing. You know, a lot of people saying like, oh, well, we value all the things that we can't do now. And like, yeah, probably for 2 weeks after we get our freedom back, but then will we just take it for granted again? So I think those big questions are really hard. This whole separation of what people call academic and non-academic, which is a problem in itself, and one that I'm sure we will actually do an episode on because it's really interesting. But I think what comes from all of that, at least in terms of the creative art not really necessarily being understood and being a bit mysterious, and that being unfortunately kind of its detriment is that people sometimes see art because they consider art and creatives things that are sometimes aesthetic. They consider it as like a final flourish. They consider it as like the icing on the cake when it's in fact a key ingredient, but it's just as important and part of things. And I think that's why they are first to be let go, because you kind of don't look at it as long term. And I think that's what you were saying in terms of investing even money or time into it. Creative mind is much more than just making things look aesthetically pleasing and creative. It can be really innovative, and someone who's creative might think of something that's actually much more business oriented in terms of how you actually look at your processes, because they'll look at it from a different perspective, and different perspectives are always useful. So what we're consuming, there's a creative behind every single thing that we are holding so precious to our mental stability right now. And if there's all these things we can learn from this, one of them that would be great would be to kind of have respect for the creative process and for what it allows us to do, even on a basic level, like Skype our family.
The interesting thing about Corona will be we've all kind of shared this experience of forced isolation and having to turn to artistic things like movies and books to stay sane. So maybe next time someone questions the value of creativity, we can point to this and be like, hey, remember that time you were trapped in your house for 2 months? What did you do? What did you turn to? And it's probably something creative.
I think just to round up, there's an obvious point that I will make as a disclaimer. In terms of this whole pandemic making us value people, it is very clear that things like the healthcare system are up there and that the whole point of this isn't that, you know, we should just all value how wonderful our paint by numbers set is and how nice the interface of Netflix looks, but it's just a really nice time for reflection on these things. And I do think it'd be great if, as we move forward, people start to understand that a creative mind and what they consider maybe a more analytical, albeit, let's say, academic mind are two interconnected things, and we'll start to value people's kind of creative energies as something that is to be respected.
For sure. And so I think that kind of wraps up our thoughts on creativity and the value of creativity. And for now, that's all. I'm getting very cerulean vibes. What you don't know is that color was chosen for you by the people in this room out of a pile of stuff. How many Devil Wears Prada references can we make in one episode?
The limit does not exist.
I think in like season 5, we're going to have to go back and like make a tally and be like, we've made this many Devil Wears Prada references.
100%, yeah. And we'll have to make a competition, and if anyone can guess the right number, then they get honor.
Right, it's like one of those competitions of like, how many jelly beans are in this jar? You thought it was 5, the answer is 2,000!